There's a massive shift in global power happening right under our noses. And it's not really about armies or big political speeches. It's about the tiny, almost invisible materials that build our entire modern world. And what happens when one country gets the power to just turn off the supply. Let's get into it.
So let me just start with this question, and I want you to really think about it, not as some sci-fi scenario, but as a real, practical problem. What happens when the most powerful military on Earth suddenly can't build its most advanced stuff anymore?
And look, this quote, this says it all. This isn't some blogger or some think tank analyst. That is the CEO of Raytheon, one of the biggest defense contractors in the world, flat out admitting they're totally dependent on a strategic rival. I mean, that is a jaw-dropping thing to say out loud, and it's the key to understanding everything we're about to unpack.
Okay, so let's talk about this dependency. It all boils down to a handful of critical minerals. You know that old saying, right? For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost, all the way up until the kingdom was lost. Well, today, that nail is a tiny piece of refined metal that most people have never even heard of.
And when you look at this list, you really start to see how deep this goes. We call them rare earths, but they should really be called everywhere earths because they are in everything. The phone you're holding, the electric car you might drive, the wind turbines powering your home, and yeah, the drones and hypersonic missiles that are supposed to defend you. All of it depends on these little things, and one country has a stranglehold on the supply.
So here's where the theoretical problem becomes a very, very real crisis. China's not just sitting on this economic leverage anymore. They're using it as a weapon. They've officially said, we're done. No more rare earths for your fancy military hardware. The nail has just been yanked out of the horseshoe.
So you might be thinking, okay, this is a major supply chain problem. And it is, but that's just the first domino. Because this military vulnerability, it starts to expose a much deeper problem at the very heart of the entire global financial system. And that's the US dollar itself.
So for more than 50 years, this is basically how the world has worked. Every country holds US dollars. They buy US government debt, treasury bonds, because it's seen as the safest possible asset on the planet. This is the absolute bedrock of America's economic power in the world.
And here's the dirty little secret about this system. It wasn't just built on trust, it was built on power. The unspoken threat has always been, hey, you can do what you want, but if you seriously mess with the dollar's dominance, you're going to have to deal with the US military, right? But what happens when that military can't get the parts it needs to function?
Well, the enforcer is looking a little weaker, and the rest of the world has definitely noticed. Central banks around the globe, they're not shouting it from the rooftops, but they are quietly changing what they do. And get this, for the first time in the modern era, the value of gold held by the world's central banks has officially overtaken the value of the US treasuries they hold. That's not some minor headline, that is a tectonic shift happening under the surface.
Okay, so this brings us to the industrial reality on the ground. And sometimes, the only way to really grasp a tragedy is to see the dark humor in it.
Just let these numbers sink in for a second. China can pump out the motors for 4,000 cruise missiles a week. The United States has a total stockpile of about 6,000 Tomahawk missiles, the entire inventory. They could basically replicate our entire arsenal in, a week and a half? That's not a gap, that is a chasm.
And if you want one single perfect metaphor for this whole situation, this is it. The historic Philadelphia Navy Yard. This place used to build the mighty destroyers for the US Navy. Today, it's the corporate headquarters for anthropology. We went from making naval destroyers to making cute dresses. I mean, you have to laugh, right? But it's also a pretty brutal symbol of what's happened to our industrial base.
So what do you do when you're facing this kind of industrial gap and these huge financial challenges? Well, when you're backed into a corner, you gotta get creative and maybe a little desperate.
Okay, so here's one of the plays on the table. It's called the stablecoin gambit. It's kind of complex, but the basic idea is this. You get the crypto world, which needs to back its digital dollars with real assets to buy up tons and tons of short-term US debt. Why? Because it's getting harder to find other buyers for all that debt. It's a clever little workaround, but like one analyst said, it's basically the kissing cousin of just printing more cash.
If you thought that last plan was kind of wild, check this one out. What if the US Treasury just decides its gold is worth more? Like a lot more. If they just changed the number on the spreadsheet and revalued gold to, say, $20,000 an ounce, poof,
They could create $5 trillion out of thin air, not by earning it, not by mining it, but just by changing an accounting entry. That's the kind of break glass in case of emergency stuff being talked about. So, where does all this leave us? Well, it leaves us at a really serious crossroads, one that means we have to face some very uncomfortable truths about where things really stand.
I absolutely love this analogy because it's hilarious and it's also painfully accurate. There's this massive disconnect between the current condition of the country and its ambitions. You can't just wake up one day and decide to run an Ironman. First, you have to admit you have a problem, then you have to get off the couch and maybe, just maybe, start by walking to the mailbox. It's a long, slow process, and it has to start with some humility.
And that really brings us to the root of all this. And it's one simple word: hubris. Over a century ago, Europeans saw Chinese merchants physically weighing their silver for transactions and thought, oh, look at these primitive people, they're generations behind us. But the reality was, because China had gone through hyperinflation, they were actually a generation ahead. They knew not to trust paper money. The parallels to today are, well, they're pretty hard to ignore, aren't they?
And so that brings us to the final and most important question. The facts on the ground are what they are. The industrial base has been hollowed out, financial dominance is being challenged, and rivals are making big, strategic moves. The math is the math. The only real variable left is the mindset. Is America ready to swallow its pride, look in the mirror, and do the incredibly hard work it's going to take to compete in this new world? Because the answer to that question is going to define the rest of this century.